My name is Hebe. I'm a member of the Intel organization, and I have the pleasure to talk with Omar today. It's actually the first time Omar is able to attend Manifiesta, so welcome very much, Omar. He have a lot of talks this weekend, but we are very pleased that in the Intel tent we can have a first informal talk with Omar about his life and what he's doing as an activist. So Omar, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
How are you? How was your trip?
It was good.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being
Enjoying
here.
the wonderful Belgian weather.
Yeah, it's a typical Belgian weather for a start. Maybe for the people in the room, you can explain a bit yourself. Who are you and how did you become such an important activist for the Palestinian cause?
I don't know about important, but I'm an activist. I was born son of refugees. My mother and my father are refugees from both sides. My father is a refugee from the 67 expulsion. My mother is a refugee. Her parents are from Safad. Her mother is from Safad, which is in the north of historic Palestine. So I grew up as a refugee, dreaming of going to Palestine. Like many Palestinian refugees, like many refugees around the world. They dream of going home. But home is away not because of poverty or a tsunami or some natural disaster, it's because it's colonized, because it's still colonized. So when I hear all the talk about post-colonialism, we're not post, we're still in colonialism, very much. So that's how I grew up in a family that cares a lot about rights and resists, insists on resisting. So it was natural for me to become an activist. It wasn't something I had to think about twice. The main point is that in this work that I'm doing with many colleagues around the world, we are interested in meaningful solidarity, which means not charity. It means understanding responsibility towards ending the complicity of your states, your corporations, your institutions in maintaining the system that oppresses us, that denies our rights. So that's my main interest as an activist.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It's already interesting. Maybe the people don't know it in the room, but you are actually a co-founder of the BDS movement, Boycott, Divest and Sanction movement. I think maybe a lot of people know the abbreviation of the word, but can you maybe explain a bit what the movement is and what you're doing?
Sure. The Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS movement, was launched in 2005 by the absolute majority of Palestinians, both inside Palestine and outside Palestine. It basically calls for three basic rights: ending the occupation, ending the system of racial domination and discrimination, which is apartheid, and the right of refugees to return. Some people might say, well, this last point is a bit problematic. You know, refugees, there's so many Palestinian refugees, there's no way the West will accept this. Can you make it easier? Can you just focus on ending the 1967 occupation and forget about the refugees? No, we can't forget about the refugees. The absolute majority of the Palestinian people are refugees. 2/3 of our people are refugees, whether outside Palestine or inside Palestine, because you have internal refugees as well. So to end all three forms of oppression, occupation, denial of refugee rights, and apartheid, we said we want to resist inside, but we need solidarity from the outside. What I was talking about meaningful solidarity, which means the Belgian state, for example, as Belgium and as part of the EU, is complicit, is implicated, is involved in Israel's regime of oppression. Belgian universities, cultural centers, pension funds, and so on. All of these are complicit because they're involved, they're invested in companies that are violating our rights. So we're not asking the Belgian people to leave everything, all their struggles, and just raise the Palestinian flag. Of course, you're struggling against this pandemic, for the health situation, for jobs, for a better environment. There's so many issues that you're struggling for. Unemployment is growing and so on. But it's connected to that. Ending complicity in Israel's crimes is connected to your domestic struggles. That's the intersectional aspect that we always need to bring about. It does not conflict with your struggle for health, for education, for social justice, racial justice, economic justice. It is very connected to that. Ending Belgian complicity in Israel's apartheid is part and parcel of that. So BDS is focusing on that, ending complicity.
So the BDS movement is not really busy with inside Palestine or boycotting things there, but really the surrounding countries to...
It's both, actually. Yeah. We do have a lot of BDS campaigns inside Palestine, but we believe in context sensitivity, which means that in every context you have to be sensitive to the conditions in that place. So Palestinians in Gaza, for example, we don't call on them to boycott every Israeli product. It's impossible. They're under siege, under occupation. Very, very few products are allowed into Gaza. So we cannot call on them. But in Belgium, we call for a boycott of everything Israeli, all Israeli companies that are involved in the occupation, in apartheid, because you have a choice. You don't have to buy Israeli tomatoes or oranges or potatoes or whatever. You have a choice. In Gaza, many times they don't have a choice. So yes, we are present in Palestine and outside as well. And as an anti-racist movement, we're very much connected with struggles around the world. Black Lives Matter, struggles for social economic justice, climate justice, and so on.
It's very interesting. Maybe can you tell us a bit more how BDS started? Because you already talked about the alliance between, for example, I think South Africa maybe has also influence in what BDS is doing. Can you maybe tell us how the BDS movement really started? Or?
Sure. BDS is inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle. Of course, we learned a lot from them. We continue to learn. We're in touch with some of the people who have led the anti-apartheid struggle. We also are inspired by the US campaigns for boycotting the Jim Crow South. The civil rights movement in the US is a major inspiration. But the main inspiration for our struggle, for the BDS movement, is our own history. Palestinian history of resistance, civil resistance, popular resistance, that used boycotts since the 1920s. So we did not learn boycotts from Gandhi or Mandela. We learned them mainly from our own people's struggles. So that's a key point. So it was launched in 2005 by the absolute majority, by the coalition that includes every major entity in Palestinian society, and it's still led by a coalition that is representative of the absolute majority.
So can we state that the BDS really represent actually the Palestinian civil society?
Yes, as far as boycott, divestment, sanctions is concerned, does not represent Palestinians politically speaking. We make a distinction because some people might say, what's your position on this or that political issue, Palestinian political issue? We don't take a position because we're not a political party. We don't represent, we don't lead the Palestinian people politically. We represent the Palestinian people as far as boycott, divestment, sanctions only, which is one form of Palestinian popular resistance and the main form of international solidarity. BDS is.
Yeah, because it looks quite difficult because there are a lot of voices in the Palestinian civil society.
Absolutely.
So how do you manage to speak as one voice as the BDS movement? How does it work in your organization?
Actually, yeah, it does sound like a miracle sometimes. You look at 3 Palestinians in the room, they have 5 opinions. There's so many divisions among us. It's true. But BDS, since the beginning, focused on the 3 basic rights that almost every Palestinian, except collaborators, agree on. Ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the rights of refugees to return. Very, very few Palestinians do not agree. So we don't take an ideological position. We don't take a 1 state versus 2 states position. This party or that party. We don't support any party. So that's a key point. Our platform is a consensus platform. The second key point is that from the beginning we decided we don't want any single political party to be a member of the BDS coalition, but we have the coalition of all political parties a member. I don't know if that's clear. In other words, no single party sits at the table of BDS, but the coalition of all parties sits at the table. They're the most important people at the table because they represent all political parties. This way, we have the best of both worlds. We have the legitimacy of all the political parties, yet We don't have their problems and their ideologies and their political fights. And no, it's not allowed on the BDS table. On the BDS table, we talk BDS. We don't allow political differences between parties to be discussed there. That's not the place for it. We all agree on basic Palestinian rights. That's how we managed to get this balance.
Thank you. Why did you resolve to boycott? Do you have the feeling that all other methods, like for example dialogue, are not sufficient enough?
There's no opposition between dialogue and boycott. Dialogue can be ethical or unethical. As someone who's also learning ethics, and that's something very important for me, unethical dialogue is a master-slave dialogue. When the master and the slave are talking and they assume it's a dialogue. It's not a dialogue, it's dictating. The master never has dialogue with the slave. The master dictates to the slave. The only way they can have a dialogue is if the slave resists to end slavery and the former master agrees to give up their privilege as master. So there's no real ethical dialogue between occupiers and occupied, colonizers and colonized, unless the colonizers accept our rights and co-resist. We have a term, co-resistance. Not coexistence under oppression, but co-resistance to oppression. Resisting together to end oppression. So there is no conflict between boycott as a form of ethical resistance to end colonization, Israel's settler colonialism and apartheid, and ethical dialogue with progressive Israelis who want to help us end their state's system of apartheid.
Very clear. Thank you. Maybe a total other question, but the Palestinian Authority, so the PA, is often seen by many Palestinians as not really, they are the authority, but they are really seen as not representative, or they don't feel represented by the PA. So I was wondering, what is the relationship between the BDS movement and the Palestinian Authority? Or how do you look to it?
Where do I start? Okay. Well, the Palestinian Authority is anything but an authority. It's really an authority under occupation, so it has very, very little power. We have no formal ties with the Palestinian Authority. It's a one-way street when we criticize them, when we condemn something they do, if they violate our guidelines, basically, which they do quite often. But the Palestinian Authority cannot claim to represent the Palestinian people. It never did. The Palestinian Authority, at best, speaks for Palestinians in the West Bank, not even in Gaza for the most part. The PLO, on the other hand, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, despite all its problems. It represents all Palestinians inside Palestine, outside Palestine. But the Palestinian Authority does not. To add to that, the Palestinian current authority, whether the West Bank Authority or the Gaza Authority, both, are unelected. They don't have a democratic mandate, even from people in the West Bank and Gaza. Forget the rest of the Palestinians. Palestinians in 48 who are citizens of the State of Israel, Palestinians in exile, 50% of our people are in exile. No one asked them their opinion. So the authority never represents those. In the BDS movement, we speak for all three parts. In the 1967 territory, in the 1948 territory, and Palestinians in exile. We have the Palestinian BDS National Committee has representation from all three parts of our people.
So can we state that the PA is really, how to say, it's a tool for the occupation to really influence Palestinians?
Without passing a political statement myself, I can't as a BDS activist, but I can say the facts. The Oslo Accords between the Palestinians and the State of Israel were intended very much by Israel to use some Palestinians as a subcontractor for the occupation. That's the design of Oslo. That's a fact. Israel does not give the Palestinian Authority much power at all. Even leaders of the Palestinian Authority do not have much power. Any little Israeli soldier can stop them at a checkpoint, can humiliate them, can beat them, and get away with it. That's how much authority they have. So, in a way, the presence of the Palestine Authority is a big debate among Palestinians. With I think a majority now are no longer convinced that this is the best way forward for the Palestinian people.
And so if there is a big debate about it, how do you, as a founder of or as a member of the BDS movement, how do you react on it? How does the BDS...
We don't. It's beyond our mandate. We don't. So we don't get into debates about the Oslo Accords, about the Palestinian Authority. Should we disband it? Is it collaborating with Israel? We address specific issues when they come up. For example, the so-called security coordination, which is being discussed now, between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. We 100% condemn it, attack it in very, very strong terms. Because that's within our mandate. The main point is to maintain the consensus.
Yeah.
It's not just coming up with a statement and then losing the consensus, becoming, factional, becoming representative of a tiny part of the Palestinian people. Then we lose our authority in Belgium, in the United States, in South Africa, in India. No one will listen to us if we don't speak for all Palestinians. So maintaining our unity in the BDS leadership is extremely important. So from the beginning we decided we don't take a position on internal Palestinian politics at all, except when it touches our guidelines, BDS guidelines.
Okay, very clear, thank you. A more personal question, but how, as an activist, how has the struggle affected you more since you are, such an important, I cannot say important due to you, but since you are such an important person for the BDS movement, does the struggle affected you more?
The struggle affected me in many ways, mostly positive ways. It enriched me. I grew intellectually, my ethical understanding of the world grew. My understanding of intersectionality grew in the movement. And of course, intersectionality is a concept we learned from black feminists in the US. But it's within the BDS movement that I got to learn what intersectionality means on the ground. What does Black Lives Matter mean? What does the LGBT movement do? What are they struggling for? What is the women's movement doing now? Not the white feminism, old feminism, but real progressive feminism. What does it really mean? How to connect our struggles. All of this I learned in the movement, in the BDS movement, in the last 17 years. So I learned a lot from the movement, but it also affected me negatively, of course, because of persecution. Israel doesn't like it when you're a Palestinian and active, or you're a Palestinian and resisting. They prefer us to be nice and quiet, but we can't be nice and quiet, because we need our rights, we need our dignity, and we need our freedom and justice. Until we get them, we will not be nice and quiet. We will continue to resist. So they intimidate me. Travel bans, as Manifiesta knows, several times I could not make it, not because I did not want to, I really tried, but because of de facto travel bans. It was de jure travel ban, evolved to de facto travel ban by Israel, on and off. Arrests, smearing. If you Google my name, every few days there's a new attack on me, fabricating things that are absolutely ridiculous, comparing me to the worst people on earth, and so on and so forth. Smearing me, threatening me, real threats against me, but that does not stop me. So I make it clear, yes, it affects me, affects my daughters. When they read anything like that, they're worried. Of course, it affects my wife, it affects my family. Everyone is worried. What will they do to you? Because they keep attacking me in such vicious, violent terms, so everyone gets alarmed. So I tell them, that's what they want. They want us to be so intimidated that I stop doing what I'm doing. But you know what? I'll increase what I'm doing. That's my response.
I can imagine. I can imagine that it's really not easy to have that mindset all the time. That there are moments that it's really, not easy to hold on to that idea. Can you maybe tell us a bit more? How do you keep hope high in such?
It is sometimes very difficult, but I'm naturally, I guess, an optimistic person, a hopeful person. I just see the positive in the midst of negative. I see the light in the midst of darkness. That's how I've always been. My father was like that, my mother was like that, both have passed away, but they were both hopeful. That we might not see liberation of Palestine in our lifetime, but maybe in your lifetime. So keep struggling. Maybe in your kids' lifetime. So I keep the hope, but I also look at my people. Forget what I suffered from. It is nothing compared to what my people are suffering from. In Gaza, for example, 2 million people under siege with very basic materials not allowed into Gaza. Clean water, electricity, you get electricity a few hours a day. I mean, basics. No freedom of travel, nothing. And when I look at that, and I see the children of Gaza going to school, producing wonderful art, coming up with wonderful scientific projects, doing dance, doing music, I say, my God, I mean, what gives them hope gives me hope. Yeah. They inspire me.
Maybe talking about hope, do you have any hope or sights for the future? What the future will bring for the BDS movement?
Yes, I'm actually quite hopeful about the BDS movement, despite the repression. Actually, maybe the repression is the best indicator of hope. Because I was interviewed recently by Peter Beinart, I don't know if some of you know him, a very influential soft Zionist academic in the United States, but very influential, and he's questioning Zionism. In any case, Peter Beinart asked me, well, BDS movement has not stopped Israel's economy from growing. Israel is, a very strong economy, not to mention a nuclear power, a very strong military, but it's also a very strong economy still. So how is BDS impacting Israel if it's not impacting the economy? So I said, forget the economy. Let's put it bluntly. Israel had, until recently, a full government ministry to fight BDS. A full ministry, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, dedicated to us. That gives me hope. They have a budget of tens of millions of dollars annually to fight us. That gives me hope. They have me under surveillance 24 hours, 7 days a week. Phone, everything, I'm under surveillance. Great, that gives me hope. So we're doing something right. And AIPAC, the main Israel lobby in the United States, has BDS as its top enemy. Top. Israel considers BDS a strategic threat of the first order. That gives me hope. We must be doing something right. Israel wouldn't spend $100 million a year fighting a movement that's hopeless, that's not affecting it. That is the biggest indicator of hope. But of course, that's looking at what the enemy is doing. But looking at the movement, in Europe, in the United States, in India, in South Africa, in Latin America, in South Korea, everywhere, the movement is growing tremendously. But just to give one example, recently there was a poll, an opinion poll of Jewish Americans. And of course the US is extremely important to us for obvious reasons. It's important for everyone, but especially for Palestinians because our miseries are made in the United States. They used to be in the United Kingdom, but now it's made in the United States. So US public opinion is extremely important for us. This was an opinion survey of Jewish Americans, and it showed that 1/5 of liberal Jewish Americans support BDS. 1/5, 1 out of every 5 liberal Jewish Americans, and most Jewish Americans are liberal, by the way, 1/5 of them supports BDS. Just imagine how much the movement has grown. So Israel is terrified. If young Jewish Americans no longer support Israel and are becoming more and more supportive of BDS, Israel is in real trouble. That gives me hope.
I can imagine that things like that gives hope for the members of the movement. Can you maybe tell us a bit more what's on the agenda of the movement? What kind of campaigns or issues are you fighting with the coming months?
There are too many to mention, but there are some focal campaigns, some global campaigns that we're focused on, especially here in Europe. We're focused on the most important issue is for the European establishment to begin to recognize Israel as an apartheid state. After Human Rights Watch issued its report that Israel is an apartheid state, after Israel's largest human rights organization, B'Tselem, issued its report that Israel is an apartheid state, it's about time the EU starts at least considering an investigation of Israeli apartheid. That's a very key priority, pushing governments, pushing parliaments to investigate Israeli apartheid, to look at the Human Rights Watch report and consider its recommendations. So that's something that needs to be pushed in the Belgian parliament as well, to properly debate the Human Rights Watch report on apartheid and consider Israel as an apartheid state. Why is that important? Because the Apartheid Convention, apartheid is a crime against humanity, according to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and the UN Convention against Apartheid. So it triggers sanctions. If you recognize a state is perpetrating the crime of apartheid, you as a state have an obligation to impose targeted sanctions to dismantle the apartheid regime. So that's a very high priority for us, investigating the United Nations, investigating Israeli apartheid, and parliaments investigating it, and so on. The second is military embargo. It's extremely important to impose a military embargo. That's the most important sanction against Israel. So we're calling for targeted lawful sanctions. The most important of them is a military embargo, two-way military embargo, not selling and buying.
Can you maybe explain a bit what a military embargo is?
Okay, military embargo is you don't sell weapons to Israel, you don't buy weapons from Israel, you don't do joint military research, military security, of course, research with Israel in any way. So academic institutions in Belgium that are still carrying out military security projects with Israeli universities are guilty. They're complicit, and we need to stop them. And that's not asking for charity. It's asking for our right. Stop killing us. Your research with Israel is killing us. We have a right to ask you to stop. We're not asking you for any charitable thing. So a military embargo is not just weapons being sold, weapons being bought, like India, like Vietnam, like Brazil. They buy billions and billions of dollars worth of Israeli weapons. But it's not just weapons, it's security systems. You heard about the Pegasus NSO crisis. Well, Israel spies on us and tests its weapons and its spy technology on us and then sells it to the world to hunt activists, to hunt journalists, to hunt progressives, in some countries to hunt LGBT activists, women activists, and so on. They're using Israeli technology, field tested on Palestinians. So the military embargo is a top priority. But also as far as grassroots campaigns, AXA, the insurance company, is complicit, and we're calling for a boycott of AXA. CAF, the train manufacturing bus company, we're calling for a boycott of CAF. Puma, anyone wearing Puma, it's too late you bought Puma, but at least put boycott on top of it. We're calling for that, and never buy Puma again.
I didn't do it from Puma. I think I have shoes with the...
Yeah, Puma sponsors the Israel Football Association, which includes Israeli settlement teams in Israel's illegal settlement. So it's a very clear-cut case.
Okay.
We're calling on them to stop sponsoring the Israel Football Association.
Don't buy Puma shoes. Okay. Maybe I can imagine people in the room have been a bit inspired by your talk. So maybe a last question from me, and afterwards we can go to the room if people have some questions. But what can we do? You already said some things like boycotting, but for example, action movements like Intel, where should we focus on? What can people in Belgium do to help the BDS movement?
I think Intel is doing great work, and I think Intel can tell many Belgians what's best to do in Belgium. They know much more than I do. What works in Belgium?
Okay, so have a talk with the Intel people. Thank you very much for all your insights, Omar. Are there people who are listening right now who have a question for Omar? Yes. You can talk Dutch or French or English if you want. I will translate. Yeah. We will firstly take a question here in the front.
Shall I just speak very loud? I remember was back of the Belgian academic BDS. Yesterday, our Minister of Exterior of Foreign Affairs, announced that the Belgian government would not participate in the Human Rights Conference 22nd of September, which recognized the 20 years of the declaration, etc., because apparently there was a very successful campaign in Europe from some lobbies that say that this conference is extremely anti-Semitic and swells in hatred of Jews and blah blah blah. So even if BDS is getting strong, which it certainly is, although sometimes it's more simple than others, but the Israeli lobby apparently is still very successful as well on the highest political level. How can we deal with this situation?
You heard the question?
No.
Okay, you want to repeat it, shall I? Okay, the Belgian government has decided to boycott the UN conference commemorating 20 years since the Durban Conference World Congress Against Racism. It's 20 years anniversary coming up this month. So some European governments are boycotting it. And the claim is because the conference is anti-Semitic. Because BDS will be a very strong component, and discussing apartheid Israel will be a very strong component. So Macron in France and now the Belgian government and others are saying we don't want to go. Of course they don't want to go for a much easier reason to understand. Reparations. They don't want to discuss reparations for colonialism. The goddamn colonial masters of the world are avoiding any discussion about reparations to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America. That's the real reason why they won't go. But let me address the issue of anti-Semitism. Since you brought it up, we haven't discussed it yet, so that's a very good point. Israel and its lobbies across the world, definitely it has a lot of political influence in governments. We are strong at the grassroots, not at government's level, not yet. Some governments we do have influence, but we're mostly active at the grassroots level. Translating grassroots power to policy change takes a long time. One parliament member at a time, one party at a time, until we have a majority in parliament. I was active in the South African anti-apartheid movement. It took forever in the US. It took forever to change Congress, as you know. Churches and trade unions and student groups and women's groups, everyone was anti-apartheid, but it took us forever to switch opinions at the Congress level. So it will take time. But the issue of anti-Semitism is important. Israel and its far-right allies, and many Israeli allies in Europe are far-right, anti-Semitic far-right groups across Europe, and they have the guts to call people struggling for Palestinian rights anti-Semitic. So Israel is conflating activism to end its apartheid, settler colonial system with anti-Jewish hatred. There's absolutely no connection between them. Actually, it's anti-Semitic to make this conflation. Why? Because if you say that an attack on Israel is an anti-Semitic attack, it's against all Jews, you're equating Israel with all Jews, and that's very anti-Semitic. You're saying all Jews are one and the same, represented by Israel. They have no diversity, no political views. All Jews, you know, those people are all the same. That's a very anti-Semitic statement. So Israel is making a very anti-Semitic statement by claiming to speak on behalf of all Jews. We absolutely, categorically reject anti-Jewish racism. That's a very important principle in our movement. We're absolutely opposed to anti-Semitism. But we will never accept anyone smearing our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality as anti-Semitic. They are the anti-Semites.
Yes, please.
So, I'm not sure if you can hear me at all. Socialist activist and a member of Polish Parliament, chair of Polish Palestinian Parliamentary Group, and vice chairman of International Committee of Polish Parliament. So I both cooperate with activists and Palestine authorities. And maybe it's not Polish specific. I know the whole criticism, I agree with it. But for example, Palestinian ambassador in Poland is just Palestinian diplomat and a good advocate for Palestinian cause. So, for example, if we have attack on Gaza, we have this popular protest inside Palestinian embassy, which is activist protest, not some kind of authorities protest. So that's a thing that is a bit different for me, because I have to join two levels. This level of activists and cooperating with basically Palestinian diplomats, because that's the connection I have. So that's the thing, how to treat this outside representation of Palestinians, and because somehow it's useful, despite of all things that they do on the ground in Palestine. So that's just first.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not calling for not dealing with Palestinian embassies. No, those are embassies of the Palestinian people. So whenever the embassy is doing good work, it should be supported. We should work with it. We're not calling for not working with Palestinian embassies or representative missions. But we're saying when the Palestinian Authority commits crimes against Palestinians, as they've done recently. We issued a statement, actually, the BDS movement, because he has no democratic mandate since 2009. He was not elected since 2009. But he's the one who took the decision. But under the dictates of Israel and the United States and the European Union cheerleading, of course. The Knesset from Likud, the Netanyahu's political party, said, quote, it was in Haaretz, they may be anti-Semites, but they're on our side. So it's okay to be anti-Semitic as long as you're on our side. That is the new anti-Semitism that Israel is advocating. So it's absolutely important to work with Jewish progressives, not from a utilitarian perspective, not because I need a Jewish figure to put in front, because they're true allies. It's a principled position. Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States, progressive Jewish groups in Belgium and everywhere are our allies, they're our partners in struggle. That we're not just using them, we work together, we resist together.
Thank you. I have a quick look around to someone from Intel. Is there still time for some questions? Because there are. 50 minutes? Okay, perfect. Sir in the front here, yeah.
I must ask you in Arabic language because English is very, very modest.
In Arabic?
Make it in Dutch, easier Dutch, so that everyone understands, and she will translate to me.
Can you speak another language than Arabic?
I ask you in Arabic language and you can answer me in English. Okay?
Would you like to translate Arabic?
سيدي أنت تعرف الغرب لم يتخلص من تاريخه الكولونيالي ولا زال يتعامل معنا باستغلالنا في ازدواجية المعايير ومعالجة القضايا العادلة من بينها القضية الفلسطينية. هذا الشق الأول من سؤالي. الشق الثاني، هل القضية الفلسطينية وأنا أقصد السلطة الفلسطينية لا زالت تراهن على هذا الغرب وهي باختيارها هذا استراتيجي أقول كادت تنسي القضية الفلسطينية لولا الناس أمثالكم لا زالوا يذكرون القضية الفلسطينية في العالم.
Okay, so the question is, the West in general is still very colonial. It's not post-colonial, it's very colonial and still deals with us in the Arab region as a very colonial power. And the Palestine question shows Western hypocrisy more than any other thing. Talking about human rights, and when it comes to the Palestinians, it's okay for Israel to maintain a system that violates their rights. So the question was, the Palestinian Authority is betting on the West still. They're still hoping that this West will salvage us, will give us our rights. How do I feel about this? So my answer is, I don't know and I don't care what the Palestinian Authority is betting on. I care about our people and what we do as a movement. The Palestinian Authority, at best, is hopeless. Hopeless. They will not deliver justice for the Palestinian people. They cannot deliver basics to the authority itself. Forget delivering justice to the Palestinian people. I think a majority of Palestinians now agree, there is no hope that the Palestinian Authority will liberate us. We have to do it ourselves with progressives around the world. We don't rely on the West as in the colonial powers. We force them. We don't beg them. We don't even convince them. We have to force them to accept our rights and to end their complicity. What do I mean by force them? Non-violently, of course, we're a non-violent movement. I mean working with all progressive movements. Let's take Belgium. What was mentioned, this minister decided we're not going to this conference because it's anti-Semitic and so on. We work with progressives, progressive parties, progressive movements, women's movements and so on, to pressure the parties in parliament to take the right position. So we keep building the grassroots movement. There's no shortcut. We have to continue building the movement to have enough power. It's all about power. Without power, no politician will listen to us. Most politicians want to be re-elected. If you tell them, you know what, if you are anti-Palestinian, you won't be re-elected because many people, enough people are saying, we connect Palestine with our struggles here for health, for education, for the climate, and so on and so forth. That's the way to affect policy change. Not by begging, and not by appealing only, yeah, please, we're victims. No, we're not just victims. We resist, and we demand that you in this country end complicity in denying us our rights. So it's a demand, it's not a charitable appeal.
So people power, if I understand right, and in order to reach that, it's important to organize. So if you have the idea after this talk, I really want to be part of the movement, just organize yourself and become a member of Intel or other organizations who are organizing the movement. Maybe time for another question?
Thank you. Omar, I would really like to thank you for coming to Manifiesta. It's an honor to be close through here. I'm a worker at a Volvo cars factory. Volvo is implicit in the colonization and occupation of Palestine. Volvo is very big in Belgium. Like 10,000 of people work for Volvo cars, trucks, parts, all the other companies. And I discovered during in May, during the clash, that a lot of my colleagues are very sympathetic to the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle. I mean, very sympathetic. Like a lot of people, hundreds of workers in Belgium want to support your struggle. My question to you now is, can you give us a little bit more of information how Volvo helps the occupation? And can you give practical examples how to organize workers, how to have power, and how to support your struggle here in Belgium and shut it down?
Okay, thank you for this. For those who haven't heard, that's about the Volvo, the Swedish company, Chinese now, that has a main factory in Belgium, and that many workers at Volvo are opposed to what Volvo is doing to the Palestinians. It's selling, basically it's selling bulldozers to the Israeli military, to Israel, which is, Israel is using Volvo bulldozers, among others, Caterpillar, JCB, to demolish Palestinian homes, to destroy Palestinian farms, olive trees, orange orchards, and so on and so forth. They're destroying our lives, basically. So Volvo is one of the companies that's helping Israel destroy our lives. So definitely it's a very complicit company. But how do we talk to the workers who work for Volvo? We are calling for an international boycott, yes. But one example is what we did with Veolia. Veolia, the huge French company, was involved in the tram in Jerusalem that connects Israel's illegal settlements with the occupied Jerusalem. We met with 3 trade unions in Bilbao, in the Basque country, representing Volvo workers, Veolia workers. So we talked to them about international law, Palestinian rights, and it's like, oh. They're working for Veolia. What do you want from them? I mean, it's their company, it's their bread and butter. So I took the floor. I said, can I speak? I said, forget Palestinian rights. You need bread and butter. You're workers. You need good working conditions. We are calling for a boycott of your company. If your company does not pull out of Israel's illegal projects, we will bring it to its knees. We will make it lose so much money. What do big corporations do when they lose a lot of money? They lay off workers, unfortunately. So you and we have a lot in common. You want to maintain your jobs, and we want you to maintain your jobs. Help us push your company to get the hell out of the occupied territories. And the next day, the 3 unions took our stickers, boycott Veolia, and plastered all the buses in Bilbao. We couldn't do it because the police would catch us. It took the workers, Veolia workers. All the buses in Bilbao had boycott Veolia in them. They got the message. 7 years later, this was 2008. 7 years later, 2015, Veolia ended all its business in Israel and pulled out completely after losing more than 20 billion, with a B, milliard, dollars worth of contracts around the world. The Veolia workers in Bilbao take some credit for that. So in the case of Volvo, I would say the same. Help us push the company to the top.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Thijs from the Netherlands. I have a question on the Israeli population. So I was wondering, of course we talked about how we are in solidarity with Palestinians, and the Palestinians, of course, themselves are also in favor of BDS movement. But are there also sections or groups within the Israeli population which are not complicit with the Netanyahu government, with the apartheid, which also support their struggle? Or are they like too small, too marginal to make any change? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, we do have Israeli anti-colonial partners. Actually, I mentioned them in the beginning of my talk, that we look at them as partners in the struggle. That's what, when I mentioned co-resistance, when you asked me about dialogue, I said, yeah, we have dialogue, ethical dialogue with those who oppose denying our rights, who want to help us resist oppression. So there are thousands of Jewish Israelis who stand with us, who stand even with BDS, who support the Palestinian right of return for refugees, who support an end to apartheid, who support an end to the occupation. It's a small group, yes, thousands, but it's growing. And more importantly, its moral weight across the world is growing as well. So when progressive, anti-colonial Jewish Israelis lobby the Dutch parliament because of Dutch racism, they are listened to much more than they listen to us. You know, fellow whites, basically. We listen, those brown people, you know, Belgian parliament, French parliament, you name it, European parliaments in general, they tend to be quite racist, and people of color are less significant to them. And our Jewish Israeli partners understand this very well. So they help us in every struggle, in every campaign. I'll give you one example, and I'll end with this. You know Snoop Dogg? Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg, you know Snoop Dogg, the big hip-hop rapper. He was invited to perform in Israel, I don't know after which massacres. Usually after Israel commits a massacre in Gaza, they invite big celebrities to cover up, art wash, whitewash by art, their crimes. So they invited Snoop Dogg, and he accepted. And in Israel there was euphoria, sold out, you know, Snoop Dogg is coming to Israel. And we were just so annoyed. We wrote to him a letter explaining that how, if he performs in Tel Aviv, apartheid, we explained everything. No response. Then our Israeli partners asked us, do you want us to intervene? We said, yes, please do, because he's not listening to us. They wrote to him. Within 2 days, 3 days, he canceled. He never performed in Tel Aviv. And so we understood later from someone related to his circles, he did get the Palestinian letter, but put it on the side. Then he got the Israeli letter, and then he went back to our letter, and then he really learned about the issue, and decided, I'm not going. So they do, they're few, but they help a lot in so many campaigns around the world.
Thank you for all the questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but Omar, thank you really much for all your insights. I found it very interesting. I loved listening to you. And for the people in the room who also loved Omar, he also has a talk on Sunday. Maybe you can quickly tell us where you're going to talk about, because it will be another subject than we talked here, so that the people who loved to listen to you can also...
It will focus on solidarity. that since May, since Israel's attack on Gaza and Sheikh Jarrah and so on, all of you have seen the solidarity with Palestine growing in an unprecedented way. We will talk a lot about that, why, how is it growing, and what can be done.
Looks very cool. So thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to see you there.